Tack and Coffee, A Soldier's Life in the Civil War is a classic memoir written by John D. Billings, first published in 1887. This engaging account provides a vivid and often humorous look into the daily lives of Union soldiers during the American Civil War. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe. These are Billings' words. Let's begin. Many facts related to this subject have already been presented in the opening chapter, but there is still much more to share. I hope the reader will indulge me as I include a small piece of personal history to illustrate what thousands of young men were doing at that time and had been doing for months. This account directly connects to the theme under consideration. After finally obtaining my father's reluctant consent to enlist, my mother never gave hers. The next step was choosing the organization to which I would tie my fortunes. I vividly remember the August evening when I made the decision to enlist, an eventful and life-changing moment for me. At the time, the Union Army under McClellan had been driven back from Richmond during the disastrous Peninsular Campaign. Meanwhile, General Lee's Confederate forces were advancing on Washington. In response, President Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 three-year volunteers. One evening, shortly after this call, I met 3 of my former schoolmates and neighbors in the main village of our town. After a brief discussion about the dire situation, one of us issued a challenge: let's enlist. We all shook hands to seal the agreement. Out of the 4, 3 of us kept that promise. The 4th was persuaded to remain with his employer by the offer of higher wages. However, he later joined the service and returned with a shell scar on his face as proof of his honorable service. Having firmly decided to enlist, I returned home and informed my father. Unlike the year before, when he had strongly objected, this time he said, "Well, you know I don't want you to go. But it's clear many more must, and if you're determined, I won't stand in your way." With my mind made up about the branch of service I wanted to join, I set off with 3 other acquaintances, 2 of whom were the schoolmates mentioned, to Cambridge. We sought out Captain Porter, who was recruiting for the 1st Massachusetts Battery. 2 men from our town already served in his company, and we hoped to join them. However, Captain Porter informed us his company had already reached full strength. Disappointed, we headed back to Boston and enlisted in a new organization that was rapidly forming. This took place on the 2nd floor of the old State House. Looking back, I am grateful that fate steered me away from Captain Porter's company. While I was initially disappointed, joining an established company as a recruit was often an unenviable position. Recruits were like college freshmen enduring hazing. Without any experience in camping, cooking, drilling, marching, or fighting, they were at a significant disadvantage. Many veterans ridiculed them, forgetting they had also been inexperienced once. However, some men showed kindness and guidance, helping recruits adjust and rise to the veterans' level. During the later years of the war, when town, city, and state governments offered large bounties to encourage enlistments, new recruits were often unfairly labeled bounty jumpers by ill-natured veterans. True bounty jumpers, however, were those who enlisted solely for the money and deserted at the first opportunity. Recruits generally endured the abuse they faced with remarkable patience. They were eager to earn the veterans' approval and prove themselves. Once they demonstrated bravery in battle, the term recruit disappeared, and they were welcomed as equals. Ironically, those who mocked recruits the most were often the least reliable in combat or shirked camp duties. Veterans occasionally played pranks on recruits, especially when assigning them tasks. In the artillery, recruits often had to care for the spare or sick horses, a challenging and sometimes unpleasant duty. Despite these hardships, many recruits eventually adapted, earning their place and respect in the ranks through perseverance and dedication. When a detail made up of recruits and veterans was sent with wagons to collect wood, the veterans would slyly pat the recruits on the back, cajoling them into doing most of the chopping. They would then challenge the recruits to lift the heaviest ends of the logs into the wagons, a task the recruits seldom refused. In the artillery, recruits were often assigned to care for spare or worn-out horses. This was not done out of any desire to impose on them but because cannoneers and drivers already had regular tasks, and all recruits in the artillery began as spare men, working their way up from the position of private to that of cannoneer, the highest rank among privates. Recruits always arrived in camp flush with money and were promptly encouraged by the camp bummers to spend it freely. If they resisted and chose to save, they often found themselves ostracized, their lot made much harder. When boxes of goodies arrived from home, the veterans typically claimed the lion's share. If a recruit didn't willingly share, the mean-spirited among the veterans would steal the treats while the recruit was away on detail. Practical jokes were also a constant source of torment for new recruits. I recall a young man in my company who had just arrived and, after collecting his clothing and equipment from the quartermaster, was asked by one of the jokers why he hadn't received his umbrella. "Do they issue umbrellas?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Of course," replied his tormentor without hesitation. "That quartermaster is always looking for ways to shortchange recruits. Go back and demand your umbrella, and make sure it's a good one." The poor recruit, indignant at what he perceived as a swindle, marched back to the quartermaster to demand his umbrella. The confusion and eventual realization of the joke created no small amount of amusement in the camp. Recruits came in two broad types. The first group consisted of modest, straightforward men who accepted the deprivations of army life with grace. They brought no luxuries to ease their transition into the harsh reality of government-issued fare and service. These men wore their issued clothing without complaint, from the awkwardly shaped forage cap to the coarse, inelastic socks. It didn't bother them that nothing fit quite right. They accepted their gear with good humor, finding as much comfort in ill-fitting uniforms as others might after a visit to the company tailor. Although they initially looked somewhat comical and unsoldierly, over time they adjusted and began to spruce up. These men were content with standard army rations, even the dreaded salt horse, which older soldiers typically avoided. They rarely grumbled about fatigue duty, were eager to learn, and worked hard to earn their place among the veterans. Their humility and diligence often earned them the respect of the older soldiers. The second group of recruits was markedly different. These individuals were neither modest nor inclined to blend in. They arrived dressed in flashy, custom-made uniforms designed to impress. Their caps bore silver and gilt emblems rather than plain brass, and their pants were tailored from the finest materials, a stark contrast to the shoddy, coarse uniforms of the seasoned veterans. Their boots were extravagant, cavalry style, reaching above the knee, sometimes crafted from finely grained or enameled leather, elaborately stitched and stamped. These boots seemed more a symbol of social superiority than functional footwear. However, it seldom took more than a single hard march to reduce both the boots and their wearers to a state of humility. Their shirts were just as ostentatious, often white and boiled, or, if wool, in loud checkered patterns almost as bold as the flag they had sworn to defend. Their overall appearance resembled that of military dandies, though such a term hadn't yet entered popular usage. While they were entitled to wear anything that complied with Army regulations, their choices often provoked disdainful remarks from veterans. These recruits scoffed at government rations as long as their bounty money lasted and a sutler was within reach. But when their funds ran out, their disdain turned to despair, and they cursed the war with all their hearts. Initially, they were useless on fatigue duty, a fact the veterans exploited to make their lives miserable. However, after weeks of grueling labor and relentless teasing, most of these recruits shed their airs and adjusted to the rigors of camp life. Sergeants, tasked with training them, showed no leniency, keeping them hard at work until the recall from drill. It was especially entertaining in the artillery to see one of these well-dressed recruits assigned to care for spare horses, which were often in poor condition. The recruit was expected to groom, feed, and water the animals, tasks for which he was frequently unprepared. At the sound of the watering call, when the sergeant pointed out the horses and bridles, the fun would begin. The recruit would look at the bridle, then at the horse, unsure of how to proceed. Initially, he would lead the animals to water, but as he grew more confident, he would mount one. With legs awkwardly bent and gripping tightly, he presented a laughable sight until he learned the ropes. Training raw recruits of both these types was one of the many trials faced by the officers responsible for them. Making reliable soldiers out of such diverse and often unpolished individuals required immense patience. This task was further complicated by the fact that many recruits, especially those arriving in 1864 and 1865, spoke little or no English. General Hancock once recounted that the 20th Massachusetts Regiment received nearly 200 German recruits just days before the Battle of Reims Station, none of whom could understand their officers' orders. One can only imagine the time and effort required to mold such individuals into disciplined, effective soldiers. There were many men in the ranks who, despite speaking English, consistently struggled with basic drills and commands. They were often described as hay-footers when they should have been straw-footers, a playful jab at their inability to distinguish left from right. These men were part of the infamous awkward squad, and their presence often made life lively for the sergeants tasked with their training. When they marched in the rear rank, their primary ambition seemed to be stepping on the heels of the men in front of them. Yet, they would insist that it was the front-rank men who were out of step. This led many in the front rank to wish that the regulation 13 inches from chest to back were extended to 13 feet. However, during backward marches, the front-rank men often relished the chance to get even. Watching these men attempt to change step while marching was a spectacle in itself. Their movements resembled a game of hopscotch, hopping first on one foot and then on both, or a bird, like a blue jay, bouncing up and down on a branch. If such a squad was given a sudden command to halt, chaos ensued. Aligning them afterward was a monumental task, as each man seemed to have his own interpretation of straight. Heads craned and twisted in all directions, making the sergeant's job even harder. One Irish sergeant famously exclaimed in frustration, "Oh begorra, what a bent row! Come out here, lads, and take a look at yourselves." The same lack of coordination extended to their mastery of the manual of arms. At shoulder arms, their muskets pointed in every conceivable direction, from 45 degrees to straight up. When commanded to move to carry arms, a portion of the squad inevitably dropped their weapons. At order arms, no two rifle butts hit the ground at the same time. Some men frequently managed to drop their muskets on their neighbors' toes instead of their own. Despite these comedic failings, many of these men rose to the occasion when it truly mattered. Although their performance on the drill field or parade ground was often laughable, they could generally be counted on when the time came for serious action. In some instances, when their drills or parades were particularly poor, these men were punished, sometimes unjustly, with the dreaded knapsack drill. This involved marching with a heavily loaded knapsack and was meant to discipline and strengthen, though it was often viewed as excessive. It was a fortunate turn of events that the war concluded when it did, as the quality of recruits in 1864 and 1865 had significantly declined. By this time, the initial wave of patriotic fervor had waned, and many of those enlisting did so purely for financial gain. These bounty-driven recruits, lacking true dedication, often provided little value to the service. As a result, the burden of fighting the war's final, most challenging battles fell largely on the shoulders of the seasoned soldiers who had enlisted in 1861, 1862, and 1863. The experiences of recruits enlisting with the original regiments in 1861 and 1862 were unique and often challenging. Unlike those who joined established units later, these men had no frame of reference for military life. Their decision to enlist was driven by pure patriotism and a desire to quash rebellion. They imagined themselves joining the fight immediately, with no concept of the training and preparation required. This naivety led to significant hardships. For many, the most difficult period was the time spent in home camps, waiting for their regiments to be deployed. These camps were often within sight of their homes but far removed from the comforts of civilian life. Soldiers would bid tearful farewells to their families, believing they were leaving for good, only to find themselves still in camp days, weeks, or even months later. False alarms about departure dates were frequent, leading to frustration and emotional strain for both the soldiers and their families. Some men obtained furloughs to say one last goodbye, while others simply sneaked away, taking their chances with the camp guard, which often turned a blind eye. This period of waiting was marked by a mixture of camaraderie and homesickness. On sunny days, camp streets were filled with visiting families and friends. Young men paraded with their sisters, cousins, or sweethearts, drawing the envy of those whose loved ones were too far away to visit. Fathers and mothers came to see their sons, bringing small comforts from home, warm socks, woolen scarves, medicines, and treats. These gestures of care, though heartfelt, often overloaded the young soldiers, who were already burdened with their standard-issue equipment. The adjustment to military discipline was another source of tension. Free-spirited American citizens found it difficult to submit to authority, particularly when their officers were former peers. This dynamic led to friction, as soldiers accused their officers of putting on airs or abusing their newfound power. Over time, however, as the realities of war became apparent, discipline improved, and soldiers came to understand the necessity of a structured chain of command. By 1863, with voluntary enlistment slowing, the government introduced a draft to bolster the ranks. Wealthier men often hired substitutes to serve in their place. While some of these substitutes proved to be reliable soldiers, many enlisted solely for the bounty and deserted at the first opportunity. Conscription was deeply unpopular, and public sentiment against it ran high. A satirical song from the period captured the mixed feelings about these recruits and substitutes. One verse went, "I'm a raw recruit, with a brand new suit. $900 bounty. And I've come down from Derby town to fight for Oxford County." If there was ever a day that stood out in the monotonous life of a soldier, it was when he received a box from home, sent by the loved ones he left behind when he joined the service. Whenever it seemed likely that the army would remain in one place for 2 or 3 weeks, the average soldier would immediately write a letter home. In that letter, he would carefully list the items he wanted sent in a box and provide explicit instructions for addressing it, ensuring its safe arrival. A typical address might read as follows: Sergeant John J. Smith, Company A, 19th Massachusetts Regiment, 2nd Brigade, 2nd Division, 2nd Corps, Army of the Potomac, Stevensburg, Virginia. Care of Captain James Brown. In reality, much of this detail was unnecessary. A box addressed with just the name, company, regiment, and Washington, D.C. would have arrived just as safely, as everything was forwarded from there to Army headquarters for distribution. However, most soldiers preferred to include every possible detail to ensure nothing went amiss. The boxes sent were usually substantial in size, often a shoe case or soap box, and rarely smaller than a packing capacity. Their contents varied but tended to align with requests made in the soldier's letter. On the back of an old envelope, I once found a partial list of such requests: round-headed nails, for boot heels, hatchet, for cutting kindling or tent poles, pudding, turkey, pickles, onions, pepper, paper, envelopes, stockings, potatoes, chocolate, condensed milk, sugar, butter, broma, and preservative, for boots. Quantities were left to the thoughtful discretion of the parents or loved ones preparing the box. Besides these essentials, soldiers often requested woolen shirts, towels, custom-made boots, needles, thread, buttons, and yarn. For food, boiled ham, tea, cheese, cake, and preserves were popular choices. Not surprisingly, items to sustain and comfort the inner man were given the most attention in such lists. It was heartbreaking for a soldier to learn the army had moved before his box could arrive. Often, he would have already received a letter detailing its contents, describing in loving detail all the delicacies packed with care. Such letters would leave his mouth watering and his spirits crushed when he realized he might never taste them. These boxes weren't just practical, they represented the love and support of family and friends. Entire neighborhoods often contributed to a box being sent, each neighbor adding a small token to brighten the soldier's day. To the soldier, however, the thought of these treasures spoiling before he could enjoy them was deeply disheartening. Nevertheless, he had to endure the disappointment and accept the situation. Adding to the frustration was the mandatory inspection of every box at brigade or regimental headquarters to ensure no intoxicating liquors were smuggled in. For soldiers who didn't drink, this was particularly annoying. Many men lost a cherished bottle of whiskey or brandy, confiscated as contraband despite being innocently disguised. Inspectors often missed some cleverly hidden bottles, though. Soldiers developed ingenious methods of concealment, stuffing a bottle into a roasted turkey, sealing it in a tin can of small cakes, or inserting it into a loaf of cake through a discreet hole. Despite these efforts, some bottles were punctured during packing, resulting in the entire box being infused with the scent of spilled spirits. The inspection process could be vexing even when no contraband was involved. Boxes were often carefully packed, with every inch of space utilized, but inspectors rarely managed to repack them as neatly. This led to jumbled contents, broken jars, or misplaced items. In my experience, though, I must admit that I never lost a single item from any box I received, aside from the occasional broken bottle. The contents generally arrived intact, though sometimes the boxes were sent directly to company headquarters without inspection, particularly when the owner wasn't known for indulging in alcohol. When boxes finally arrived, they often came by the wagon load, pulled by mule teams. These deliveries were cause for celebration in camp. The fortunate recipients gathered around the wagons with eager anticipation, their excitement contagious. Even those who hadn't received a box would join in the festivities, offering congratulations and often receiving invitations to watch the unboxing. Observing a comrade unveil the treasures inside was, for some, the next best thing to receiving their own. The art of packing these boxes seemed to reach perfection during the war. Every corner and crevice was filled, not with paper but with useful items like potatoes, apples, onions, dried fruits, peanuts, and other edibles. Boots were often stuffed with small necessities, such as socks, thread, or needles. Amidst the carefully wrapped glass jars of preserves, cans of condensed milk, and roasted chickens, there might be a roll of bandages or a note from a neighbor wishing the soldier well. Each item, whether practical or sentimental, spoke volumes of love and care. Sadly, some soldiers had no one at home to send them such thoughtful packages. These men would watch their comrades open their boxes with a mixture of happiness for their friends and sadness for their own solitude. Often, the fortunate recipients would share generously, ensuring their less fortunate comrades could also enjoy the treats. However, there were always a few selfish individuals who hoarded their boxes, refusing to share even a bite. These men kept their boxes hidden and consumed the contents in secret, oblivious to the camaraderie they missed by doing so. I recall one such man whose box contained a peck of raw onions. When the army moved before he could finish them, instead of sharing, he packed the onions with some old clothes and shipped them back home. Such selfishness was rare, though. The hardships of war generally fostered a sense of generosity and camaraderie among soldiers. Most shared freely, understanding that in the trenches, the bonds of brotherhood often mattered more than the comforts of home. The army sutler played a significant role as a civilian quartermaster to the soldiers, providing goods and services outside of official supplies. By army regulations, each regiment, corps, or separate detachment could appoint one sutler with the approval of commanding officers. These individuals made a business of catering to soldiers' needs, selling a wide range of items from food to dry goods. Each regiment had its own sutler, who set up shop near the camp, usually in a large hospital tent, and displayed wares to tempt soldiers with items they often craved but could not obtain from standard military rations. The sutler's primary trade revolved around food, especially canned goods, which were mainly purchased for officers' messes. At the time, the canning of meats, fruits, and vegetables was still a relatively new process. Prices for these items, already high in peacetime, soared during the war. For the average private earning $13 per month, or $16 after a pay increase on June 20, 1864, thanks to Senator Henry Wilson's efforts, even sampling such luxuries required outside financial support from family. Many soldiers, when paid after months of arrears, would find their entire wages claimed by sutlers to settle debts accrued during the interim. The prices sutlers charged often shocked soldiers. Butter, often rancid, cost $1 per pound. Cheese was 50 cents per pound, condensed milk was 75 cents per can, and a plug of Navy tobacco sold for $1.25. Molasses cakes or cookies, sold at 6 for a quarter, were a rare affordable treat. These desserts became a welcome break from the monotony of hardtack, as did sugar, molasses, and flour sold by sutlers, though these staples were more expensive than their commissary counterparts. The commissary officer, responsible for government rations, supplied quartermasters with provisions based on requisitions from commanding officers. Commissaries also sold supplies for officers' messes at cost price and allowed enlisted men to purchase items if they presented a signed order from a commissioned officer. Toward the war's end, sutlers began selling self-raising flour in small packages, popular among soldiers for making pancakes or fritters. Cooking these treats became a spectacle, especially when turning them in the fry pan required a practiced toss. Many cakes landed in the fire or dirt due to miscalculations, much to the amusement of onlookers. Sutlers' pies were infamous for their mysterious contents. With a tough upper crust, a soggy base, and questionable fillings, they defied analysis. Despite their dubious quality, soldiers consumed them eagerly, paying 25 cents each, moderate compared to other goods but steep for their small size and poor quality. Beyond food, sutlers also sold a limited range of dry goods, such as regulation hats, cavalry boots, flannels, socks, and suspenders. They were prohibited from selling liquor, and violations often resulted in losing their license to operate. Despite their importance, sutlers were not always held in high regard. Many soldiers viewed them as profiteers who exploited the hardships of war without contributing to the fighting effort. The high prices they charged only fueled this perception. However, it is worth noting that sutlers faced significant challenges and risks. Transporting goods to the army was costly, and much of their stock was vulnerable to weather damage or loss during frequent relocations. They also risked losing everything in the event of a defeat or retreat. Considering these factors, along with rising costs during wartime, it's arguable that most sutlers charged fairly for their services. Some sutlers became victims of organized raids by soldiers who resented their prices. These raids, often conducted under the cover of darkness, involved groups of soldiers toppling a sutler's tent, looting goods, and quickly dispersing. In some cases, even officers tacitly approved of these actions, especially if they believed the sutler's pricing was exploitative. When this occurred, identifying and punishing the culprits was difficult, as officers feigned ignorance or subtly warned soldiers to avoid getting caught. One such incident occurred during the winter of 1864 near Brandy Station, Virginia, in the Artillery Brigade of the 3rd Corps. The brigade sutler had set up his tent near the 10th Battery Camp, where soldiers closely observed incoming supplies. One thirsty soldier stole a case of whiskey, intended for a battery commander, right from a wagon. When the theft was discovered, the captain ordered a full assembly of the company and a search of the quarters. Despite thorough efforts, no trace of the stolen whiskey was found. The mystery was only solved after the war. The culprit had hidden the case in a manure pile by the picket rope and later moved it to a concealed spot on a nearby hill, where he periodically retrieved his prize until it was depleted. The high prices sutlers charged were not unique to the Union Army. In Richmond, Confederate citizens faced exorbitant costs for basic goods. Potatoes sold for $80 per bushel, chickens for $50 each, and butter for $20 per pound. Flour cost $1,500 per barrel, while $1 in gold was valued at $100 in Confederate currency. That concludes the 7th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.